on, and we are live on YouTube. Welcome. It is your fearful host in this residual time of pandemic podcasting, joined by two phenomenal intellects, two phenomenal friends, two phenomenal thinkers that inspire me. And we're approaching 1,000 people right off the bat. And it's no surprise. They're here to see me. No, they're here to see Dr. Eric Weinstein, Professor Avi Loeb. How are you guys today?
Great, thank you.
We're well, thanks.
I last saw you both together in Miami at a Bitcoin conference where, Avi, you made a stunning announcement. You said, go all in on Dogecoin. I cannot believe I followed that advice, Avi. You cost me my pension, such as it is.
No, I will never give advice that I personally do not follow.
Very good. So, guys, we are here to talk about a variety of topics, but I think none as important as this recent announcement that we recently heard about from none other than NASA about this phenomenal decision to actually study the UAP phenomenon and what that might entail for both scientists who are not usually interested in such things, but kind of orthodox, so to speak, a smaller lowercase o. And so first, I want to get interpretation. Maybe we'll start with Avi on this reaction. You have a wonderful link. I put a link to your Medium post about. It's called "Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery." And I just like that very much. So I want to get your take on it. What is going on with NASA? Why do you think that they've suddenly kind of maybe, I don't want to say changed their tune, but perhaps they have? What do you guys? What do you think, Avi? First of all, right off the bat, what was your reaction?
Yeah, it's relatively simple to understand what happened. Bill Nelson was very intrigued by unidentified aerial phenomena because as a senator, he saw some classified data that is not available to the public. And now that he became the head of NASA, he said that when the director of national intelligence, Avril Haines, released a report to Congress back a year ago, he said that scientists should get engaged because he believes it's a serious matter. And of course, he's the head of NASA, but someone has to translate that statement into action. And the following morning, I contacted the person responsible for science under him, Thomas Zurbuchen, and he immediately called me, and I told him, look, I'm here to make your boss happy, and I'll be glad to assist you in that. And he asked me to send a white paper, which I did, but I've never heard back from him. And now we hear the echo of that exchange that we had. And a year later, NASA, in its very sluggish and political manner, does something. Now, what is this something? There will be a committee that will review the existing data sets and will recommend to NASA whether to fund the research programs that will analyze the existing data sets that are open to the public and perhaps collect new data sets. And that recommendation will come in a year or so from now because the committee will need the 9 months of pregnancy before delivering a baby. And they will start their work only in about a few months from now. So altogether, a year from now, there will be a report. And then in the best case scenario, NASA would say, okay, that sounds intriguing. We'll allocate a few $1 million to this research agenda. And then the Congress will have to appropriate those funds and approve them. And then the funding will actually be provided 2 years from now. Okay. So I'm saying 2 years from now, we already have an ongoing Galileo project, a scientific research project. In 2 years, we will have enough data to perhaps change the charter of this study. You know, science cannot wait for government to move. Science, if it's funded properly, operates much faster than that because we are curious. I'm just like a kid. I want to figure out the answer. I will not wait for NASA to get its act together. Mm-hmm. So we established the Galileo Project. We'll find out what's out there. The sky is not classified. We'll figure it out.
Now, you had kind of recently celebrated or almost celebrated the anniversary of the last time we spoke on this podcast, but that was in preparation for this announcement of the Galileo Project. And I wonder, if we might think that NASA is somehow really influenced by it. Obviously, the title of your post on Medium, which I have a link to in the show notes below, and that is refers to imitation. So we're not talking about the Turing test here. So when you made up the idea, when you had the idea for the for Project Galileo Project, was it really to cast as wide a net as possible, or was it to focus like a laser using the astronomical tools and cutting edge technology that we now have in the community, rather than having such a wide net that who knows what would be captured in your favorite seashore analogy?
Well, there are two approaches that one can imagine. One is waiting for the government to declassify that data that Bill Nelson saw. That seems to be very intriguing because not only he spoke about it, but former CIA directors and former directors of national intelligence spoke about it as a serious matter. But that is just like waiting for Godot, like in Samuel Beckett's play. We can wait forever. A much better approach, is to recognize that the government is not releasing the data because it was obtained by classified sensors. It's not so much that the data is the data would have been classified if it indicated activity from China or Russia. The data is classified since the government cannot figure out what it means, and then the sensors used to derive it are classified, and that's why the data is not publicly shared. So I say, forget about it. Let's just collect new data. Science is about reproducibility of results. If a few multi-billionaires showed up at the porch of my home, gave me a couple of $1 million, I decided to allocate it for this project, the Galileo Project, and that's what we are using. And building new telescope systems, you have to understand, astronomers look at the sky, but they are focused on very distant sources of light. If a bird flies above their telescope, they ignore it. And we want to focus on that bird and say it's a bird. And if we see a drone, it's a drone. But if it's something else, not natural or human-made, we will say it's not natural or human-made. And we want high-resolution, high-quality data. So we use the state-of-the-art equipment. It's not a camera on a jittery cockpit of a fighter jet. And it's not eyewitness testimonies. You can't write a scientific paper based on what people tell you. We are not at ancient times now. We have to do so. The Galileo Project is basically an attempt to collect new data, new evidence, using the scientific method without prejudice, being agnostic about what we might find in our fishing net. We cast a fishing net, it's a fishing expedition. We don't know what we will find. It's probably a mixed bag. It will be a collection of natural objects, a collection of human-made objects. But even if one object happens to come from an extraterrestrial technological origin, that will be the most significant discovery of humanity. And that's very different from the objective of the government, which worries about national security and the safety of military personnel. So they have to attend to any report, irrespective of how good the data is. We don't need to care about the fuzzy data, or eyewitness testimonies. We just want one object that has exceptional data where you can read off the label made on exoplanet Y.
Yeah. And if you look, Eric, at this, first of all, I want to give a shout out to Eric's mugs, because last time he had on the standard model, Mexican hat and so forth, we drank tequila on Cinco de Mayo. Today's got a donut, and that's appropriate because this is Father's Day weekend. Happy Father's Day. You guys are father figures, not only to your children, your wonderful children, but also to many people around the world, ideologically at least. But I sent out some dad jokes, in preparation for this. And one of them was, what did the donut say to his lover? He said, thanks for making me whole. Eric, what is your interest in all of this? Is it the dream of not the Galileans, but the Einsteins, if not the Weinsteins, to traverse space and time? What is your interest? You've been one of the most foremost scientists that's been looking into this, who also plays a very important role in public discourse. So why do you care about this for those that might not be aware of it?
I don't like being lied to. And I don't like being lied to in particular about items of national security. And I especially don't like it when it's done poorly. So one of my chief complaints is that if you really have a national security threat and you don't call up your regular physics corps for an issue of physical interest, it's sort of like everything about this topic is wrong. And I don't really like the topic because it's one of two super interesting things to me at this point. It's either some multi-decade nonsense campaign, which would explain why we don't have any really good video, photograph, or artifacts that conclusively end this topic.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's a many-year cover-up of an understanding that we've been dealing with something almost beyond comprehension, which would explain all the indirect evidence for this. And it's also the case that if this is a real phenomenon of craft not manufactured on this earth, it's not an issue of technology. And I think we've become incredibly confused about life, that somehow we're so focused on markets, we only think about technology. We don't think about the change in the science that would have to explain the new technology. So the way I look at this, this is an issue of public trust. I'm going to slightly disagree with my colleague, Professor Loeb, not with his conclusion that we have to not wait for the government, but we have to pressure the government in part by doing this ourselves. Because if science is going to be a public good that we cannot commercialize because it falls outside of the intellectual property rules of our country, we expect a very high level of support and a very high level of dialogue. And the intrusion of sort of bad-tempered, ill-bred children in the compact between government and science has been most unwelcome. So it's really important to recognize that whatever this is, it's important for restoring government credibility. If there's been a giant lie that's been told for many years, we need to understand it scientifically and undo it. If it's a question of there's a real security threat, we need our best people on this. So I'm just sort of having the sense that the world has gone crazy outside of a small number of people. And I wasn't crazy, but I was stupid. I really just didn't think anything of this topic until 2 years ago. So I'm very, very late to this party. And in part, one of the things that's really important to me is that we not let the people who recognize that this was a real scientific issue early take it on the chin for being early, and then immediately turn to the sort of blue chip, institutional class to prettify this. And it's very important to me that we go through a process of restoring scientific credibility to people who've made eye contact with this, not necessarily have said it's aliens or it's UFOs from Alpha Centauri or whatever, but people who said there is something here, it is mysterious. And I've now gone deep enough into this world to understand that you're in trouble no matter what conclusion you come to. Either you have to account for why there's no direct evidence that's worth anything, or you have to account for why there's so much indirect evidence that would be seemingly almost impossible to assemble if there was no there. And neither of those conclusions is a comfortable one for me. And the last thing I want to say is that you also get into this thing with the government, which I don't understand, where people reach out, they tell you that you're going to be flown out to see some site, to see some evidence, you're prepared to sign an NDA, you're prepared to sort of play ball as a good citizen and as part of the scientific core of the United States. And then everything always gets hold off and held up, and we're going to have to, where there's a committee meeting and there's some people who need to be placated. And this is I can't tell you how many times this has now happened with 4 or 5 different channels that don't even seem to be aware of each other. So there's something very weird about hurry up and wait going on with this particular topic in a way that I've never seen before. And I am tired of being run around. If I'm put under some agreement, I can keep my mouth shut, but I'm going to be speculating about what this is up until somebody tells me what the hell we actually know about this very strange phenomenon.
Okay, I'm very naive relative to Eric. I was born on a farm. I'm still a farm boy, so my naivety shows up in the following way.
He did.
I do think that the government is incapable of hiding something it knows. Okay,
Sorry, Avi, you said the government is incapable. You believe that the government is not capable of covering up at this level?
I
just wanted to clarify.
My guess is the government is incompetent. First of all, it's split into many different sections that deal with national security, and they don't tell each other what they're doing because of national security concerns. They don't want too many people to know what each person does in government, okay? So that already introduces a lot of viscosity to transfer of information, okay? But on top of that, on this topic, there is a stigma, and people prefer not to talk about it so that they maintain an image of being the adult in the room, okay? And so that you combine these two together, and it's possible the government came across evidence that once they clarify that it's not China or Russia, they say, okay, we don't want to sound crazy. Let's just forget about it since it's not Russia or China, and they just leave it aside. I don't think it's a matter of anything beyond. It's just that the government is not a scientific organization. Now,
So it's
for
not
me,
malice; it's incompetence.
yeah,
Not malice.
and for me, and it's all related to the fact that sensors that are used for national security, like for example, missile warning system that need to know about ballistic missile heading towards the US. If they see something that looks not like a ballistic missile, they don't. It's not a ballistic. They don't care about if it came from another planet, as long as it's not threatening the life of people in the US. And so my point is that. Government is not a scientific organization. It's motivated by national security considerations, and things that fall outside of that are often dismissed, especially if there is a stigma on them. So now the question is, we hear those reports, we hear the echoes. It's sort of like being outside the room where the adults are speaking with each other. You hear some noises, and it looks like the adults are really discussing it very seriously. So you say, okay, there is something there that they are discussing. Why are they spending so much time discussing it? I'm just like a kid. I hear the adults discussing something. I want to figure out what it is. And the adults don't tell me what it is. And so I just say, okay, well, the sky is not classified. Let's just figure it out ourselves. Why do we need to wait and listen? And I don't have an issue with government. They can do whatever they want. But as a scientist, for millions of dollars, I can build equipment that will give me the answer. So it's ridiculous for me to ask the adults to give me the answer when I can figure it out myself.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, this drew a lot of kind of controversial remarks, and not the the requisite amount of snarkiness, even from colleagues and folks, but especially those looking at the budget for this new NASA program. I put the link to a piece in Axios, written by a woman, Miriam Kramer, who I don't know, but I know her bio says it's not aliens, it's never aliens. I don't know if she reached out to you, Avi or Eric, but
yeah, I spoke with her a lot in the past, but yeah, go ahead.
This is talking about the riskiness of this NASA program, both reputationally, for the normally staid and very impressive government organization that is NASA, but also to the reputation of astronomers. Katie Mack, who's a prolific denizen of astronomy and all things related to public outreach. She said something to the effect of, we shouldn't connect UFOs to astrobiology or any other thing other than a sort of aliens of the gaps argument where people assume that if they don't have an explanation, it might be aliens. How do you react to such a statement?
Well, I should say I'm most surprised by people that work on SETI, because many of them objected to any scientific study of this, and also resisted allowing in conferences, lectures on this subject. It was banned. And now I say, okay, the government really wants to know the answer. How can the scientific community shy away from it? It's very often said that we shouldn't waste taxpayers' money. Well, guess what? The government and the public that pays the taxes are very curious about this. So how can scientists say, no, this is too speculative, we don't want to deal with it? Obviously, this should be in the mainstream of science. And what you see very often are people that blog or have presence on social media, like the ones you mentioned, and they are just figuring out where the wind blows. They want to be popular. They want to get as many likes as possible. I will not mention names, but they basically say what they think people would like to hear. Okay, and I bet you that once the wind will change direction, they will change direction. And to me, that's not the way a scientist should work. It's not a popularity contest. We need to figure out the truth, and we need to investigate the subjects that are of interest to government and the public, and irrespective of where the wind is blowing at this moment in time, because the wind will change direction in the future. I've seen it many times in the context of exoplanets that were ridiculed when I started astrophysics. Gravitational wave astrophysics was ridiculed. It's very often that the wind is blowing in the wrong direction, because it's blowing in the direction of so-called experts, people that worked on things for a long while and want to maintain the landscape of research the same as they are familiar with. And that's counteracting innovation in science. So
Yeah.
we should ignore that. Yeah.
When you look, Eric, at the the transition since you and I first started talking about this over 2 years ago at the beginning of my pandemic excursions into podcasting, would you have expected that NASA would provide a six-figure budget? It's rumored that the budget for the NASA program is 100,000 or so, which is only one 11th of the Galileo Project budget. I should say that, Eric, you are a member of the external advisory committee for Project Galileo, I believe. I used to be, but I have since stepped down due to other requirements. But Eric, is that are you still involved in Galileo Project as an external kind of?
No, not external. He's in the research team.
Oh, he's in the research. Okay, sorry, I didn't recall. I was confusing,
I'm
conflating myself with
affiliated
Eric.
the project, and I'm interested in. I mean, look, there are a lot of people who don't belong in science, and we sold science is fun and science is a good time, and it's not really true. Science is a calling, and it's grueling, and it's dangerous, and all these things. We need the people who are trying to spread shame and fear to go back under their comforters and duvets and hide there until this gets sorted out. Nobody knows what this is. It may be a propaganda campaign on behalf of the government. Whatever it is, it's a something. And the idea that investigating it puts you at risk reputationally. I'm just going to pass over this in silence. It's embarrassing that we have such people in science. There's not much we can do. This isn't a question of studying astrology. There's a claim that their data exists. There's a tremendous amount of firsthand encounters that are had with pretty reputable people. And one of the things I've been just shocked by is the number of completely sober individuals who once or twice in their life appeared to have had some sort of UAP UFO experience that was effectively impossible to dismiss as swamp gas or a Mylar balloon. And whatever this is, it deserves investigation, even if what we find out is that, that there's some mineral in the water that can induce hallucinations that look like cigar-shaped objects. Whatever it is doesn't matter. But the most important thing is just to drive the shamers and haters out of serious scientific discourse, because science is based on a certain level of trust and a certain level of professional ethics. And we can't afford such people trying to steal other people's grants or trying to ding other people's reputations just to play the cutthroat academic version of the Hunger Games or the blogging sphere. So I think it's really important just to recognize what we're talking about is the scientific equivalent of a mean girl's lunch table in middle school. And it's very important just to drive them underground and to return fire. Like, let's not take this as shame. I'm certainly not saying that we are being visited by aliens. I'm saying something is going on, and whether it's a government disinformation campaign or we've been in contact with little green men for years, I can't tell you. What I can tell you is something is going on, and science investigates a something. We apologize to no one, and with all due respect and with all the love from science, if you're not down with that, get the hell out of our way.
So, go ahead, Avi.
It's very often said to me, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which is a quote from Carl Sagan. But, as much as he was a member of my department many decades ago, I completely disagree with him because extraordinary evidence requires extraordinary funding. We invested $10 billion to confirm the Higgs boson through the Large Hadron Collider. Now, you could have said, well, it's an extraordinary claim. We don't have evidence for it. The Higgs boson doesn't exist. That's not the way science is done. If there is a question that is worthwhile, either because we have good reasons to believe that something exists or because there are reports of anomalous phenomena, in this case from the government, from other sources, then we should examine it. And unless you put funds towards it, it's just like sitting at home and saying, I don't have neighbors. Well, guess what? You have to look through your windows to find your neighbors, and you better use a telescope. So it's completely unprofessional. I think it reflects more on the quality of those scientists who make these statements, uh, more than on the subject itself. And the stigma should go the other way.
And thinking about the culture and not being able to dissociate it, my comment for you guys is, your crosstown rival, MIT, David Kaiser, he makes a point in his recent book, Quantum Legacies, that the alien kind of phenomena first percolated into the American consciousness around the same time as the nuclear age, the quantum revolution, the electronics, digital revolution. What about this current epoch? I mean, I can't escape the fact that you guys were at this Bitcoin conference where I lost, all my money on Dogecoin. No, I'm just kidding. But we are going to talk about an NFT project that is close to both, at least Avi, and what I'm interested in with my recent translation of Galileo's dialogue for the first time, or not translation, but audiobook, and an NFT associated with it. But is there anything about the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times now, that is causing this, where you have senators and not the kooky one, you have legitimate senators, looking at this phenomenon? You have military. Is there anything in the air, so to speak, that is commensurate, maybe to a lesser degree, than in the 1940s and 50s when this first surfaced from Roswell onward?
Well, I think the data gathering capabilities that we have are so much better now. And so, while in the past you could have said, oh, it's probably just a malfunction of the detector or whatever, nowadays you cannot ignore it because we have much better sensors. And if you want to ask why now, I think it's the accumulation of data. It's the fact that perhaps we are developing these AI systems. You may ask, why is there activity? If we are getting close to creating a conscious AI system, or an AI system that is indistinguishable from the human mind, that would be of interest to extraterrestrials. For us to have a nuclear reactor, is not such a great accomplishment, because there are much bigger nuclear reactors in the form of stars out there in nature. But there is nothing like an artificial intelligence system that comes along naturally. And that's a milestone that, once we have a system of that nature, could attract attention.
Mm-hmm.
I feel slightly differently about it. I
Mm-hmm.
guess
Go ahead.
I think that it may be that when you fuse nuclei, you send a signal that you're pretty close to the end of the basic rules of physics. And that's controversial because people like the idea that physics is an infinite process, not like finding all continental land masses, where at some point you add the last one and you're done. I'm concerned that we just don't have a scientific method extended. One of the things that Avi and I talk about is the extension of the scientific method to novel circumstances. For example, it's very rare that humans ever study something more intelligent than themselves. And
Speak
in
for yourself,
particular,
Eric. Speak for yourself, Eric.
well, I'm married as well, so I do study my wife's behavior, but that's not what I was getting at, Brian. Thank you for bringing that up.
Good, good.
What we have is a situation in which, what if you're the rat in a psychologist's maze and you're trying to figure out when the psychologist provides you with sugar water or cheese? Everything reverses. It's also the case that when we capture technology, if we capture it from the wild, we're usually talking about a chimpanzee has figured out how to fish ants with a stick. It's not usually the case that we come across something like a computer or a spaceship that has capabilities that we lack. I mean, an example of this would be like the Antikythera mechanism, which was discovered in a shipwreck dive where it was a human civilization, but one far more advanced than any we had known about like 1,000 years ago. So the scientific method has to be extended. And one of the reasons I'm interested in the Galileo Project is the discussion about what is the responsible extension of the scientific method. It's also the case, for example, if you look at cuttlefish skin, it's probably the most advanced camouflage system found in nature. What if so in the UAP world, that would be called signature management. And what would it be like to study something that doesn't want to be studied, is more advanced than you are, is studying you while you are studying it, and knows physical laws that you know nothing of. I just spent several days at 2 physics conferences at UCLA that Zvi Byrne was organizing. And in the first one, Nima Arkani Hamed from the Institute for Advanced Study brought up one of his favorite points, which is the demise of space-time. That space-time is doomed, and it is only going to be seen in the future as an emergent mathematical structure, a map which is not the territory. The interesting thing about that, though, is if you take the point of view that space-time is merely an effective theory, then you have to ask yourself the question, does the theory that renders space-time an effective theory, that contains space-time, does that have new degrees of freedom that something else can get access to, and that we're trapped in this much lower dimensional, more compressed effective theory, while something else is aware of a more fundamental theory? And in that paradigm, the scientific method is relatively mute on most of these topics. So we tend to believe that we're in general position, we're smarter than what we're studying, we can repeat it many times at will. And all of these things have to be adjusted. Now, we've met that a little bit with respect to things like the Big Bang and the surface of last scattering. And I think Avi made a really brilliant point, although he made it in a way that I might slightly disagree with. But the point is much better than my disagreement. The point is that intelligence may be much rarer than fusion, which I totally agree with. And I think that that's a really interesting thing. But it may be also that the reason that we have summoned something to our shores is that we've indicated something that we do not know. We may think physics is going to go on forever, and whatever it is that may be watching us may know exactly how close we are to parity with it. So rather than it being tens of millions of years more advanced than ourselves, which is very much in keeping with the zeitgeist of today. The zeitgeist of today is against individual achievement. It's against the triumph of human intelligence. It's against the idea of power laws, where certain people are much more productive than teams of others, et cetera, et cetera. This thing may know that we are much farther along and much more of a threat to it than we know we are. If you think about it, what if you suddenly found that orcas had developed opposable flippers and were just miles ahead of what we thought large dolphins could do in the sea? It would give us a huge shock. What I think is that it is entirely possible that whatever the successor to space-time is allows for things that we can't yet think about, and that it may be that we're a lot farther towards learning our fundamental truth than we know, and that may be of interest to something watching us.
Yeah, if I may add to what Eric just said, the one thing that marks the current time is the development of AI, artificial intelligence system, that may be eventually similar to the human mind. And you just, if you ever pushed a baby in a stroller on the street, you would recognize that the baby, when it passes by other babies, finds them much more interesting than yourself. Therefore, if we are dealing with AI astronauts...
But Avi, my baby likes the toaster oven better than me. So it's not saying much.
But my point is simple, that we are used to Darwinian evolution here on Earth, where random processes select the fittest, the survival of the fittest. In fact, the extension of that, once we started developing technology, is technological selection, not natural selection, but technological selection in interstellar space. It's those gadgets that are autonomous, don't need guidance from their senders. Then their senders may be dead by now. These are AI astronauts. And they may be also our destiny, our future. If we send out those monuments of sentient AI systems to space, I can guarantee that to you that they are much better than the monuments you find in, for example, Harvard Square, Harvard Yard, which are monuments of past presidents and deans that try to preserve their physical image. These are static sculptures, and when kids pass by them, they usually yawn. And my point is that sending AI astronauts is our future, and it may have been the future of other civilizations, because most of the sun-like stars formed billions of years before the sun, so they were just ahead of us.
Mm-hmm. One thing I wanted to ask you, I've been working on it in my mind since you and I had a chance to talk over a year ago when you launched the Galileo Project and gave me that scoop that I appreciate so much. And that was with reference to the fact that we don't seem to see aliens in our solar system. And the reason I think that's significant in the context of what Fred Hoyle and others called panspermia seems to be, at least at some level, capable of establishing an upper limit on evolutionary fecundity in some way. In other words, we've had life on Earth for how long, Avi? 4 billion years, 3 billion years, something like that.
Yeah,
And
hundreds of millions of years. It started hundreds of millions of years after the Earth cooled, so
yeah,
it
so it's
was really quick,
billions,
very.
yeah. And it's efficient once it gets started, and replication occurs and information storage obeys. Now we haven't searched everywhere, and your friend Carl Sagan that we spoke about, I have a finger puppet of him here. He said absence of evidence is an evidence of absence. He said all sorts of things, like Feynman. I love when people quote Feynman. He'll say something like, if you can't explain it to your grandmother, you don't understand it. And then he'll say, if I could explain it to you, a newspaper reporter, it isn't worth a Nobel Prize. So I don't want to make too much of these great, people in the pantheon of science in history, but the fact that we don't see any life on anywhere else in the solar system, even, can that be used to set some kind of a limit on the ability for us to place Bayesian priors on the likelihood of finding life outside the solar system, let alone technological life? Or am I just way off here?
No, I mean, it's life can be very subtle. For example, it can be under the ice of Enceladus or Europa, and we haven't drilled the ice yet to find out if there is any fish in the ocean under it. Uh, it, there were some astronomers suggesting last year that perhaps there is life in the clouds of Venus. So these are very exotic environments, and the
Mm-hmm.
life would be quite different than we find here on Earth. But I think we are really at the infancy of searching, and it may be different from Earth for sure, because the physical conditions there are different. So it's sort of like going on a date without knowing what your date would look like, and so you're looking around the room, and it doesn't look like it's a human. There is a human like yourself out there, but that doesn't mean that your date is not next to you in some
Mm-hmm.
different form.
Yeah. Eric, when we think about the kind of motivation, perhaps, of journalists or other non-government organizations, um, how do you actually assess this? You've been very vocal about the need, as you just articulated, to not humiliate people. It's not part of science, but journalists aren't scientists, right? They're the first to admit that, hopefully. What standards of journalism do you think there need to be, if any, to report on such things without encouraging ridicule and the prosthetic forehead problem of that is worthy of ridicule at some level? What do you think
I,
can be done about this in the public social media sphere, etc?
I don't know where good journalism is still being done. I mean, I sometimes look at Quanta and think highly of what's written there.
Mm-hmm.
But in general, I've sort of just become aghast at what Twitter has done to journalists, where we now have basically activists recruited as journalists because it can sell legacy media. Obviously, the right thing is professional standards, which are tacit understandings of what you cannot do. And I'm concerned that there's something about our phones that makes everything tend in the direction of interpersonal drama. And in order to get funding, in order to get coverage, this has to become about, is so-and-so's reputation on the rocks? Tune in next week when we'll hear. And this is nonsense. It's completely antithetical to what science is. When I look at the G-2 muon anomaly in the discussion I was just listening to for several days, you have these collegial groups that are, sort of at each other's throats, but everything is extraordinarily professional and careful, and that whatever rivalries there are not at this lunch table level. So I think that the basic issue is we've just got to get rid of people who, the emphasis on people who go after other people because they can't do their job either as scientists or as journalists covering science. And we need to replace them with better paid people in trusted positions who weigh things. And it's also, I just wanted to say that there's one other community that I'm going to call out, and I don't want to get into specifics, but the debunking community is really disappointing because what it's doing is it's crowding out critique. And critique really matters. And snark and debunking and dragging and all of this dunking on stuff is some sort of abomination that we need to get rid of. What I'm curious about right now is, what is our best data? Who holds it? Who may see it? I applaud Avi's attempt to say we should get our own data. But it's also completely ridiculous that a small number of government physicists, determined by their security clearances rather than by their facility with equations, seems to be in charge of this as their portfolio. And what I would say is that it's really important for really prominent names in the theory community to start calling for an unsealing of this stuff. And I have to say that I'm very suspicious of a government trying to keep a secret and a legion of journalists who seem to be helping them by stigmatizing anyone who asks for the secret. So I just want to take a couple of other things that are really interesting. Peter Daszak was clearly doing something in Wuhan with this virus. We haven't held hearings. We haven't figured it out. Jeffrey Epstein was doing something trafficking children under everybody's noses. No journalist has called for even the bare minimum examination of documents related to what is probably a fictional hedge fund and whether or not he was tied to the intelligence community. The firebombing of the federal courthouse in Portland was not covered in real time in a meaningful way, given the level of violence being done to a federal building. In all of these circumstances, whether it's Hunter Biden's laptop, we've seen something really interesting, which is the appearance of anti-interesting stories, stories that our professional legacy media refuses to cover, no matter how much interest is expressed by the population, and which is later found that whatever the attempt to stigmatize the story, there was far more there in all of these cases than anyone had imagined. So I think we now have to look at the UFO UAP story in light of all of these other stories. I am absolutely positive that people were trying to firebomb the federal courthouse in Portland, and that for some reason, MSNBC was not keen to cover it, just the way they weren't keen to cover Andrew Yang's presidential run. Something is happening in our journalistic layer, which is causing stories to be anti-interesting. And there's nothing more anti-interesting than Jeffrey Epstein and UFO UAP.
When I think about that, okay, go ahead, Avi.
Because moving away from politics into science and academia, okay? And the same approach that Eric is worried about in the context of politics and the media, you can find among mainstream scientists. So on the one hand, ridiculing the study of UAP, even though there is data and evidence, and science is all about collecting more evidence if some evidence looks intriguing. That's all that science is about, evidence. Whereas, while ridiculing that, maintaining a mainstream that is focused on extra dimensions for which we have no evidence, focused on some notions of space and time that were never validated by any experiment, that never made a prediction that was confirmed, and yet awards and honors are given to mainstream scientists just for proposing them, and then to other mainstream scientists just for invalidating them experimentally. And one example was large extra dimensions. You know, the person who proposed it got a prize, and the person who did an experiment later to show that there cannot be a large extra dimension got a prize. So I said, we went full circle here, and we've proven that an idea is not correct. So why was it in the mainstream to start with? And what you find is a lot of the activity in theoretical astrophysics, theoretical physics, is rooted in ideas that were never tested, never validated. So I said, that's perfectly fine. We can think about possibilities. That's perfectly fine. But at the same time, when there is intriguing evidence, to dismiss it and ridicule it, that's inappropriate. This is a culture that prefers to live in a virtual reality. Basically, ideas that bring you pleasure. It's just like putting goggles on your head and living in the metaverse where you are the smartest scientist in the world. But that's not the way science should be done. You should be wrong every now and then by comparing your ideas to data. And that's, you should be bruised sometimes because you propose something that turns out to be wrong. And the only way to allow that is to follow data, to look for evidence. And the strange thing is that not accepting that rule and basically asking how many angels can sit on the tip of a dance on the tip of a pin, that's especially in extra dimensions, that's a completely acceptable mathematical intellectual gymnastics exercise that a lot of communities can agree on and give each other. But when you ask yourself, how can that replace this seeking experimental test, that looks to me very much, the science is supposed to teach the public and government how to deal with evidence. So scientists very often say, oh, the government doesn't pay attention to evidence, doesn't pay attention to data. But if you look at the academic community, it's actually worse. And I ask myself, how is that possible? We are supposed to set an example by which we follow evidence. If there are UAP that look intriguing, we say, okay, that's interesting, let's figure it out. That's the way scientists should approach it. But instead, no, the data is uninteresting, it's not real, forget about it, let's just work on extra dimensions. Like I say, that's completely opposite to what scientists should do.
Well, I don't know if I push back with respect, as you know. And I do feel like it's a little bit of a straw man to suggest that somebody could pivot from extra dimensions to doing the type of astronomy that even you don't do, Avi. I mean, you're not actually sitting at a telescope every night. I mean, you're a theoretical astrophysicist of the highest order, and you've written on this, and you know the astronomical technology.
The question is not what I do. The question is, what do I value? Okay, and
right.
I value evidence. And when there is intriguing evidence, I will not ridicule the evidence just to continue to work on some hypothetical idea. So the real issue is that some people within our community prefer to work on theoretical ideas just because they flatter their ego, and they prefer to shy away from data. I'm not talking about 1 year, 2 years. I'm talking about 4 decades. We're talking about the career of many scientists. Yeah.
Okay. The funny problem that we have here is that we poke holes for certain conspiracies, certain outlandish ideas, and not others, right? So there are various outlandish ideas that you're allowed to discuss in public, including conspiracies, like that Russia is running the United States through Donald Trump. That was an allowable conspiracy, that he was a foot soldier of Putin. But then there are conspiracies that you're not allowed to. Now, the same thing is true for scientific theories. There are outlandish scientific theories that have somehow diplomatic immunity from the regular scientific process, and others that do not. And so we have hyper scrutiny for some and extremely lax relaxation of the rules for others. And this is in part a mystery, that there is no real scientific method that's generating this concept of the mainstream. If leading people want to work on something outlandish, that outlandish thing becomes the mainstream. And if certain people want to take a look at evidence and go through absolutely normal scientific channels to look at something that people don't want discussed, that becomes aberrant, fringe, weird, cranky behavior. Now, the fact is that that doesn't really have a lot to do with any objective standard. It has to do with the fact that there is an Overton window in science, just the way there is in political discourse. And, if you wanted to study what causes ulcers and you didn't believe it was stress, you had to experiment on yourself at some point, because that was so much a part of the orthodoxy. In all of these situations where you've seen something fall, something outlandish, we saw this with the asymmetry of the weak force. The evidence was accumulating, but it was just this thing where nobody wanted to say the weak force has no clothes. It was an emperor that we dare not question. And so in a certain sense, it's not really about extra dimensions or UFO, UAP. The question is, are we as scientists allowed to say, hey, why is string theory allowed to go on this way, or large extra dimensions, or loop quantum gravity, but not UAP, UFO, even to gather data to dismiss it by saying we had sensors up and we found nothing?
I want to
So I
ask that.
think,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
just to close it out, I think that the real issue is it's a little disturbing to many of us that there are allowable relaxations of the scientific method, and there are extremely harsh applications of scientific standards that are wielded selectively, like a cop in a town, penalizing people who look a certain way and enforcing the speed limit extremely aggressively, and letting other people speed through at 100 miles an hour and doffing their cap to them, encouraging them on their way. That's a real problem that we haven't addressed and nobody really wants to take up.
So I want to ask Avi, as a professional courtesy, what do you mean by data? I mean, I'm in my office that used to belong to Jeff and Margaret Burbidge, towering titans of astronomy and physics of the past 100 years. Here's a plate she took on at Lick Observatory. It's a galaxy. She eventually did a rotation curve. Here's the spectrum of it. On one hand, these are smudges on pieces of glass that are very fragile. On the other hand, they're pretty pictures. And on the other hand, they're data. And I want to ask you, when I hear colleagues say we need data and the data need to be public, and God damn it, the Hubble Space Telescope was built by NASA and I own it. What is data? I mean, the Hubble Deep Field is a pretty picture. There's very little science. Correct me if I'm wrong, Avi. I'll defer to you, if I'm wrong. But it's a pretty picture. There is data. There is evidence that can be extracted to look at distributions and number counts and colored magnitude diagram. You can do all sorts of things with it, but if you don't have the calibration, the flat field, the dark current, if you don't have all the stuff that goes into it. So I want to ask you, what data are we really talking about? I mean, is it cell phone camera videos? Is it like eyewitness reports? What is it exactly, Avi? And then I'd like to hear Eric's take on this.
So what I mean by data is the accumulation of quantitative signals that are collected and documented by instruments that you have full control over and whose background you understand. Okay, so it cannot be a camera in a jittery cockpit of a fighter jet. It cannot be the pilot, because people are not instruments. They have hallucinations, they have wishful thinking. So you cannot write a scientific paper saying this person told me that. I'm sorry. I mean, even if the person is sincere, that cannot be used in a scientific peer-reviewed journal. Okay. So what I mean by data is, first of all, you build instruments that you fully understand in terms of what is the background noise in the instrument, so that you can detect a signal. And then you let the instrument do its job and report back the numbers that it measured. And then you interpret those. And that's what the Galileo Project is trying to do. We were asked, why aren't we crowdsourcing or providing people an app that they will put on their iPhone so that they will give us data? This is low quality data that we have no control over. We would rather build instruments that we fully understand under conditions that are fully under our control, and then interpret the data that they collect, because then we can say, look, this instrument saw an object, let's say in the infrared, another instrument detected the same object in the optical. The object was moving along the same trajectory in both instruments. It cannot be malfunction of the instrument. And we know the acceleration cannot be produced by human-made vehicles. And it cannot definitely be representative of a bird, because we know the distance to this object. So these are the kinds of measurements that will tell us it's something else. Or if we have a high resolution image where we can see the bolts and the screws on the surface of the object, so it cannot be natural. A rock doesn't have bolts and screws on it. Or if we go and do an expedition to Papua New Guinea, where we collect the fragments from the first interstellar meteor that landed there in 2014, and then we find that the composition of those fragments is some alloy that is completely artificial, that you don't find in nature, then it's something else. So what I'm talking about are collection of quantitative measurements that indicate that it's something quite unusual. Now, we did have partial evidence of that type on Oumuamua, the first interstellar object reported. We have some partial information about this meteor that I mentioned from 2014, 4 years before Oumuamua, that my student Amir Siraj and I discovered, and the government confirmed a couple of months ago. And we know that this meteor was denser or tougher than iron because it burned only 20 kilometers above ocean level, where the stress is above, well above the yield stress of iron. So we know that it was unusual, but we don't know for sure what its origin was. And we know that it came from outside the solar system. So right now we have intriguing evidence. The same as for UAP. We don't have a conclusive argument at the moment, but that's why we should be motivated to find more data. And it always reminds me of my colleague that after a lecture at Harvard about Oumuamua, this colleague of mine focused on studying rocks for decades. So when he left the auditorium, he said to me, Oumuamua is so weird, I wish it never existed. And that is completely the opposite to what a scientist, a true scientist, should say. Obviously, an expert would like to interpret everything based on his or her past knowledge. But if you are a real scientist, you should say, this object is so intriguing, I would like to get more data on it. It's really
It's like
exciting.
Lenin reportedly said, "You might not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. You might not be interested in aliens, but Eric, what extent should you know? You and I have talked extensively about the general demarcation, Popperian ideas, but at what level would you say to Avi, "Give it up, man"? Oumuamua. It's like, in other words, what would it take for you and me, or maybe to convince Avi? And then Avi, I want to ask, what would you be convinced by that Oumuamua is not, as your book of the same name, phenomenal book, bestseller, smash hit, extraterrestrial? What would convince you, Avi? But first I want to ask Eric, is that a good question even to ask?
You know, more or less, my experience with Avi is that when Avi gets something wrong, he's eager to say that he's got it wrong.
Mm.
And that shouldn't be a remarkable characteristic of a scientist, I'm sorry to say. But, you know, just the willingness to entertain being wrong, it's contagious and it's immediately recognizable. So my feeling is I don't really need to tell. It's not like Avi's under some kind of a watch and we have to say, like, maybe he's gone around the bend on Oumuamua.
No, but
I think what he's doing is that he's trying to show conviction. And might Avi be wrong? Yes. It does not shock Avi that I think he might be wrong, and nor does it threaten our relationship. I think that we've got to take the MTV out of science in order to recognize that being wrong and making bold conjectures is normal. And if everything you've ever said is true and is right and works, you're probably not really pushing the cutting edge. I think that in terms of data, one of the great problems that we have here is that every time you try to take the perspective of somebody on the outside saying, well, maybe it's BS, maybe there's something there, I don't know. And you're talking to these people who are ex-government or aerospace contractors or in government. There's this very awkward moment where they get so frustrated with this, they say, I just wish I could show you what we have because it would end this conversation instantly. So the claim is made repeatedly by different people that what is held in terms of, like, I don't know, satellites that have tracked objects coming in from, outside of Earth orbit at incredible speeds and non-ballistic trajectories. The claim is that we have all sorts of crazy data that may not be very visual in the sense of, oh, look, a floating tic-tac. But are scientifically much more interesting because let's say you have 5 different sensors on the same object and you're absolutely convinced that it would be incredible to spoof all of them, or it would have to be a conspiracy or something. So the claim that is made repeatedly by people in positions with security clearances and the like is that the data is completely clear, that we're dealing with a real phenomena. And that's really tough on me because I haven't seen anything that looks remotely like that. In other words, I'm so bored of these 3 tantalizing videos that got released and all of the cool stuff that's shot on people's iPhones. You know, the other week I saw a supposed UAP video shot out of a plane in which a giant whale broke through the clouds and splashed back into the clouds as if they were the surface of the ocean. And I thought, well, that's much higher quality than most of the UFO videos I've ever seen. Um, so, in a weird sense, the video stuff as data, to Avi's point, is completely clear that it's not very helpful. What is claimed is that there is extremely high quality data that completely settles the question of whether we're looking at something real or not. I've never seen this data. I've heard it discussed many times. People have threatened to show it to me. People have threatened to fly me to a location. There's something that has happened every single time. So I now expect that I'm going to get some phone calls from people who claim to have this data, who claim that this is going to happen, and then it doesn't happen. And it's not just me that this has happened to. It's repeatedly with various people. So I think that in part, whatever is going on here, it's a dime that was flipped and has landed on its side for like 75 years. And since a dime is not going to stay in an unstable equilibrium on its side, you have to ask the question, is that in fact a new piece of data? What does one make of the fact that a dime could land on its side for 70 years without clear data getting into the public's hands so that anybody with a competency can look at it and say, this is not consistent with anything known to man?
And Avi, well, let me just first reset the stage here. Talking with my friends, Dr. Eric Weinstein, proprietor of the Portal Podcast, and general raconteur, impresario, advisor, friend, and mentor to many. Graduate of Harvard, which we'll get into in just a bit, and the Frank Baird Professor at Harvard, former longest-serving chair, if I'm not wrong, of Harvard's renowned astronomy department, author of #1 best-selling book, Extraterrestrial, Professor Avi Loeb of Harvard. And I am your humble podcast host, Brian Keating, proprietor of the Into the Impossible podcast, where I make videos and short form and long form interviews like this, but also short form explainers. I've yet to do one about how we would actually collect data from this. But Avi, I wanted to ask you, first of all, do you want to respond to the outrageous accusation that I made? I mean, could you be proven wrong? Is there anything conceivable that I could, and how would I do it? How would I do it, more importantly?
Of course, simple. I'm really surprised that you're asking this, because remember this image from OSIRIS-REx, this mission that landed on the asteroid Bennu, okay? Yeah. And it will bring a sample of the material that this asteroid was made of to Earth next year.
Yeah.
So it was clear from the image when it landed that it's a rock. It was obvious, okay? And I would never argue that this is not a rock because it looks like a rock. Now, what did my colleagues suggest for Oumuamua? They suggested it's a rock of a type that we've never seen before, because a rock of the type that we had seen before cannot explain all the anomalies, okay? So they suggested maybe it's a hydrogen iceberg, a chunk of frozen hydrogen.
This is Oumuamua. You're speaking
Oumuamua,
about, not Osiris.
No, Oumuamua. And they suggested maybe Oumuamua is a frozen hydrogen, and then we don't see the cometary tail because hydrogen is transparent. And I did a calculation that was published where we showed that actually it would get evaporated very quickly through interstellar space. So it cannot be a hydrogen. But let's imagine it is, okay? Then the suggestion was, okay, well, it's not a hydrogen iceberg. Maybe it's a nitrogen iceberg that was chipped off a planet like Pluto. And the problem is there is not enough solid nitrogen. But let's leave that aside. There is not enough solid nitrogen to explain a population of this magnitude. But let's just say, okay, maybe it's a nitrogen iceberg. Again, something we've never seen before. And the third possibility was a dust bunny, a cloud of dust particles 100 times less dense than air, so that it gets pushed by reflecting sunlight without any cometary tail. And I say these are the leading possibilities that the mainstream of astronomers suggested. And you ask me to say, what would convince me that it's very simple. You send something like OSIRIS-REx. If it flies through the object, then it's a dust bunny, because a cloud of dust particles 100 times less dense than air is so fluffy you can pass through it. Now, if it's a hydrogen iceberg or a nitrogen iceberg, when you land on it, it's obvious. I'm willing to bet that it's neither of these three. Okay. Now you ask me, what could it be? I say, I don't know, but maybe it is artificial in origin. That's all I'm saying. Maybe it's a leaflet from another civilization that was thin and straight, and there is a message on it. I don't know what it is. We can only imagine. But my point
But
is,
then you know, to again to
wait a
be
second.
yeah,
My point is, we can find out easily by going there, and
okay,
that's
that's my
part of
point.
the
So
Galileo
right
Project. And
when
my
you
objective is to find out the answer, and I don't care if I'm wrong or not. What I care about is people saying it's a rock of a type that we've never seen before. Case closed, forget about it, discussion closed, and ridiculing the other option
Brian,
when it's not ruled out.
Brian, let me ask you a question. Why drag this discussion to have us constantly talk about this group of people that we shouldn't really be letting guide the discussion? In other words, you're sort of saying, just to give you the chance to respond. My feeling is, when did these people get the credibility to
well,
tell
it's not
people
these
what they?
people. Hold on. It's not these
Yeah,
people. It's me. So when Avi was on the podcast to discuss Oumuamua in January 2021, I said to him, Avi, you know some billionaires, and I didn't know about Galileo Project at that point. Now I know he knows more billionaires, and so I'm going to be extra nice in my gift basket to you this coming fall. But I said, Avi, put your money where your mouth is. Have your friend who sponsored the Breakthrough Prize, have him, Yuri Milner, have him, instead of directing cell phone cameras to Proxima Centauri b, send those sensors to Oumuamua or something equivalent to it. And you said to
yeah,
me,
but
and
won't treat
I
it like
make hold
Russell
on,
T.
Eric, hold on. Avi said to me, no, it's okay, because Vera Rubin Observatory, which I agree, will have the capability. We should see hundreds of these things. But I said, Avi, there are things in science, as we know, that are 3 sigma, 4 sigma, so they should only occur by fluke 1 out of every 5 million times. And we know they happen much more often than that. What if Oumuamua is kind of the opposite of that? What if it's the one chunk of interstellar message in a bottle? We can miss it if you don't apply funding and rockets and so forth to it. So I'm going to give you a chance to respond.
But the amazing thing is that we do have funding. So these multi-billionaires came to the porch of my home, funded the Galileo Project. Just a week ago, I said we need funding for the expedition to Papua New Guinea. I just said that we need the funding. Within a week, I got $500,000. Now, I tell you, as department chair of the astronomy department at Harvard, we've been trying for a decade to raise similar funds to the giant Magellan telescope.
Right.
Okay? And here, I didn't do any fundraising. People came to me and said, that's inspiring. We like the vision. We enjoyed your book. So I'm telling you, the public cares about it. The government cares about it. Wealthy individuals care about it. I did not entice them. They came to me and said, here is the money. No strings attached. How can you explain that? Many of my colleagues work extremely hard to raise those funds or get committees in NSF or NASA, give them even a small fraction of those funds. They just come to me. Over the past decade, I was fully funded by the private sector. And that allows me to be free in my thinking. And I think that is the way of the future, because what happens in federal funding agencies very often is that they follow the advice of committees that are populated by mainstream scientists, those colleagues that ridicule deviations from the beaten path. And as a result, you don't get people going in directions that are not conservative. So I think that the current funding system is flawed.
Eric.
Brian, let me just try to get back to what I said that started this. Avi is in a very enviable position as one of the most visible and successful scientists in this area. He's sitting at Harvard. He's got an enormous number of publications, very high H index, et cetera, chaired professor. And what if somebody came out of the University of Kentucky and said the same sorts of things that Avi was saying? And you said, well, if you're so sure of that, why don't you send a probe? This gets really tiresome and really irritating. The problem has to do with, I don't want to base these discussions any longer on an anchor of this backbiting, hating community where we have to answer these questions. Well, how would you answer this? And how would you answer that? The polite answer is the adults are talking and you're not running the conversation. So we have to get back to an understanding that Avi may be fully funded and Avi may be in a position to be fully funded. And I think that that's great. But pushing everybody to release an NFT or cozy up to a billionaire, is not practical for science in general. And I'm going to stand up for the portion of us that said we had a relationship with the federal government, or the federal government more or less knew when to leave us alone, and it knew how to protect people for their careers. Our private universities are not private, they're all federally funded. They may claim to be private, but they're all getting huge amounts of money through overhead and indirect recovery, et cetera, et cetera. We have a relationship to defend because we produce a public good that is inexhaustible and inexcludable. And quite honestly, I'm not giving up on the government just because we've had an explosion of kind of centrist popularity contest thinking in science. We need to get back to the point where somebody with a good idea from the University of Kentucky who knows no billionaires has a very good chance of getting funded if it flies straight in the face of somebody at Princeton. And whether or not the faculty at Stanford or the University of Chicago is upset by this is irrelevant. The key question is, where there are good ideas, do we have smart people with slush funds who can throw money that is not directed by consensus or peer review or popularity contests or reputational concerns? And what I'm asking you from the Into the Impossible podcast is, can we allow the journalistic groups that say, is NASA putting its reputation at stake, ? Can we give them the week, the year, the decade off and actually conduct scientific discussions amongst ourselves without constantly being referenced to these people? Because this is a pretty serious issue. And I'm perfectly happy to find out that there's not a single shred of evidence of any extraterrestrial visitation, but that there's been an enormous campaign to hide our spy planes and our stealth technology, which took on this form.
Well, that's kind
whatever it is, the plea is, can you stop asking questions of the form, how would you respond to the person who just wrote an article who said the following thing? And the answer is F off. That's how I'd respond. Science is being done, and we can't constantly reference ourselves to some journalist who didn't know what they were talking about on deadline, who actually can't solve a partial differential equation.
Eric, it's not just, and Avi will certainly reciprocate this sentiment. It's not just the journalist. It's the SETI community. It's the other scientists. It's authors of books about, from scientific perspective, that have interviewed Avi. It's astrobiologists. Who would be left? Avi would be. What?
We've created a world where everyone has to guard her or his reputation constantly in order to stay one more year in the good graces of this communalist system that figures out who can breathe and whose oxygen gets shut off. So the point is that those colleagues are worth much less than colleagues of 60 years ago. And the fact is that in the Hunger Games that we've created, I'm much less interested what the person down the hall thinks about this work or that work. What I'm most interested in is which scientists have the ability to say, I may have screwed up, I'm not 100% sure, here are the things that would change my mind. And I'm least interested in the scientists who say, ooh, that's out there, that's spicy, that's weird. No, those people need to be ejected. And what I'm going to say is that inclusion has been much trumpeted, but exclusion is just as important. Who we exclude from the conversation is critical to the progress of science. And I'm trying to say that there are voices sneaking into this Q&A that I'm eager to exclude, not because I believe that they're dissident voices who must be heard and that I want to step on them. What I'm instead suggesting is that trying to murder ideas in their inchoate infancy is absolutely antithetical to science. And what we need to be doing is making sure that I'm here to level the playing field in part. And we need to step up and say that certain people, myself not included, were early on this. Certain people, myself included, got some bad information, went after people not understanding what the current situation was. And as somebody who got this topic completely wrong, it's important that we talk to people who switch their minds and who can say, I screwed up, rather than people who seem to always have their finger in the air and always seem to know exactly what the current prevailing ideas are. And that's what I'm suggesting. And I don't think that our colleagues are as important now as they used to be, because they're all on life support and it can be turned off, and we all know it and they all know it.
Well, Eric, I have to respond just because you are, kind of painting me as, and from the perspective of, someone who's attacking without actually capturing what I'm doing. What I'm doing is a process that we call annealing, that your friend Nicholas Taleb would call anti-fragility, right? The more scientific scrutiny that Avi's claims or my claims in science or your claims withstand, the better. It actually
No,
makes. I don't
no,
think
no,
that.
no, 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 no. It
How
hinges
can
on
we
the
say
word
that?
scrutiny and critique. What I'm trying to say is that we have to jealously defend the gatekeeping of what constitutes critique. And what I'm claiming is absolutely Avi needs to be critiqued. But I go back to Paul Dirac. Paul Dirac made a very clear point, which is you have to make sure that ideas are not subject to the most rigorous experiment agreement with experiment criteria too early. And in part, it's like infant industries. We have to protect new ideas like maybe this is an artificial entrant, not because that's a great idea. I have no opinion. Avi could be completely wrong about a muamua. I've got zero dogs in that fight. What I am saying is that it takes incredible courage right now to say something like that and to
Of course.
pretend that but to then claim that the critiques are something that you need to subject. This isn't anti-fragility. It's like saying we don't need a bilipid layer for the cell because all the organelles should, withstand full contact with the environment. Bullshit. What you need is a bilipid layer with some very careful gates to regulate what gets in and what gets out.
Okay.
And I don't want to give the community that is taking an easy pot shot here or there the same status as the careful community who says, I think you blew something in equation 7.
All right.
Brian,
Let me let Avi. Yeah, go ahead,
Brian,
Avi.
you studied the Galileo, right?
Yes, I do.
You
Yes, my
right.
hero.
Do you
Study
think he
him.
would have been? So, wouldn't you agree that he would have been cancelled on social media today?
He would have been canceled many times, and he would have been canceled for his scientific ideas in part, but also his political ideas, right? I mean,
Yeah.
he
So
got a lot of things wrong as well as being brilliant, right? As all scientists do.
yeah, but my point is, we can't let society control the ideas we have. We should allow evidence to guide us.
Of
And
course.
some people are wrong, and it's a learning experience. So my point is, it's not a personal contest. It's not showing that we are smart. Nature is smarter than all of us. That's why I think if we ever find clear evidence for a smarter kid on the block, it would bring us to our senses, because we keep competing with each other, just like kids in the kindergarten, playing in the sandbox. And then suppose the kids look away and there is a car passing by, it shows them the world is much bigger, yet there is something much more sophisticated going out there. And why would we fight with each other about who is slightly more intelligent,
Of
who
course.
solved the a problem in extra dimensions that we don't know exist, rather than just look around and pay attention to the evidence that looks intriguing. That is the natural thing to do. And for some reason, it's being abandoned these days. Abandoned because people prefer virtual realities. It's sort of like being high on drugs and preferring a reality that gives you pleasure on a reality that is the actual one that we share.
Yeah, well, science is a painstaking process. You don't get the instantaneous dopamine hits of thumbs up and, oh, sick burn. And this is, Avi got taken down in front of this crowd, and Eric said this to Brian and defenestrated him. But the point is, I wouldn't be having this conversation if I wasn't deeply interested in it and putting my scientific bona fides, in your service, as I did for the past year with my minuscule and very minor contributions, whatever I did. But the point is, when I think about collecting data and the process of it, I hear it said that, everything should be made, public. We should FOIA the hell out of the government. But on the other hand, I also think, like, people, if you can't get scientists to do it, it may mean that they're not interested and they're not truly curious the way Galileo or Einstein was. But it may be that they have used whatever scientific, acumen they have to triage the problems that they're going to be involved in. And this one doesn't rise to the threshold of being interested. And that's not a criticism. I'm just saying that's an explanation.
Okay, I'm a scientist and I'm interested in it.
Yep.
Point
Me too.
proven. Okay, so I prefer to go in a path that was not taken, the way Robert Frost phrased it in his poem. For him, it was the thing that made a difference in his life. For me, it's the ability as a physicist to find low-hanging fruit, because nobody walked that path, and there might be something really obvious that we will find.
Right.
So my point is, I'm a scientist. And why would that be an issue to someone if the Galileo Project is funded by the private sector? Why would that even raise an eyebrow? That everyone should be happy about it.
But Eric's not saying that. Eric's saying it shouldn't have to be. It should be funded by the public, which I agree with. It should be publicly funded. But I also think that Eric's saying maybe something I don't agree with, which is that it shouldn't be privately funded, or we shouldn't have to rely on private. And you, in fact, are relying perhaps on this NFT scenario. And I would like to hear that, because it is the first time I think it's been tried at scale. Eric, you're mocking me. I don't like that. What is the smirk for, Eric?
No, it's not. It's not. Look, what we're talking about here has a history. And the history, for example, in gravitation, there was a prize offered by what appeared to be a lunatic named Babson and the Gravity Research Foundation for a fair amount of money back in the day, for a prize critiquing gravity. And nobody in the physics community wanted to touch it up until Bryce DeWitt wrote an essay, won the money, and suddenly everybody wanted the money because Bryce DeWitt had crossed the threshold. So the question of whether people find this interesting or not interesting, you only get to ask that once money is available to actually look at the project and no reputational damage is available. And I guarantee you, Brian, that if ridiculous amounts of money and wonderful conferences and flying people first class was available, and all the top people at the Institute for Advanced Study piled in and de-risked it in terms of reputation, I guarantee you this topic would find a huge number of scientists who say, I think this is the most interesting problem in the world, who right now would say, yeah, little green men, hard pass, no thanks. So what I am trying to say is, we all know, the Gravity Research Prize is a perfect example of how human scientists are when it comes to their reputations, because reputation is survival. And to pretend like that's not going on, just to say, well, your colleagues don't necessarily agree with you. It's like, well, let's find out whether the colleagues agree. If we put a large amount of money and we destigmatize it, I will make you a bet that an enormous number of colleagues suddenly find this incredibly fascinating.
How could we do that, Avi? I mean, Eric and I have talked, and I don't expect you to have listened to every single episode of the podcast. In the past, Eric and I have talked about, this truth that society owes physicists. They owe us a lot. We created a transistor, we created a laser, we created trillions of dollars of internet. And so, but how do you monetize that ex post facto? It's not so easy as when you have the escrow account, and you're waiting for your deposit to clear, right? So how do we do something, ahead of time to fund science like this, especially speculative? But actually, let's step away. Let me just ask you a question, Avi. Stepping away from aliens, anything to do with it. Let's just say we want to fund basic research, which you and I do, Eric does. How do we do that? Leveraging before the fact contract with the government or with some other public sector funds, so that we don't get hosed again, like we did with the transistor, the laser, the maser, the internet, and also telecommunication. How do we do that ahead of time?
Well, there is a path, and it involves a shortcut. So, in other words, if you discover something that people have passion for, that people care about, and that could be revolutionary, then it will turn minds of a lot of people at once. And in the context of what we were discussing before, if I go on an expedition to Papua New Guinea and I scoop the ocean floor with a sled and a magnet, and I bring up a piece of equipment that looks like iPhone 100, okay? And what I mean by that is something that you cannot really reverse engineer, but it does miracles in your hands when you press some buttons. Okay, suppose it happens, just a futuristic. I don't like science fiction, but I'm giving you an example of something that could happen, because we are going to the ocean and are going to scoop the fragment. So suppose we happen to find it. Whether it exists or not is part of reality, and it's just a fishing expedition, and we don't know what fish we will find. So this is an example where you do the experiment, and if you find it, it changes everything. Then everyone in the world will talk about it, fund it, the scientific community will jump up and down and say, of course, we knew that. We always said that. In the 60s, someone wrote a paper about something like that. It's actually not new. And this person was, just a fisherman that found it. It's not important that this person found it. It was discussed in the 60s. And of course, we always. Now, the reason I say that is there was a congressman that made anti-gay statements for many years. And then when he left Congress, he confessed that he was gay. And to
Could
me,
never have seen that coming.
that's a clear illustration of human nature, where people that really want to discuss the subject, they can ridicule it just by looking around and seeing that other people are ridiculing it. And unfortunately, in academia, it's very prevalent. So the way to change that is to find something that will be obvious and change everything. And of course, it's not easy. We would most likely find fragments of an iron meteorite, not of but at any event, you should try. And the only way not to find it is by not searching. And that's my fundamental point, that if you have a prejudice and you say, this is too speculative, I don't want to even deal with it, you will never discover something that you didn't expect. Even if it lies on the ocean floor, there is this gadget there, you will never go and search for it, and you will fill your life. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy to remain ignorant.
So let me ask you,
Yeah.
Avi, assume that
Yeah.
you go to Papua New Guinea, you get huge funding from all of these billionaires who are crowding your porch. I'm very worried about your billionaire problem on your porch.
I have another one tomorrow. Another.
Okay. Fantastic. We'll send Orkin. Sounds like you have an infestation. So the question is, assume you find nothing, or in fact, what you find is so boring and uninteresting as to tell you that you completely screwed up and that there was nothing to be found. How do you feel the day after?
Oh no, it's if you think about life, we spend so much effort in directions that do not prove fruitful. Even if you are trying, suppose you want to marry someone, a spouse, and you have to go through many blind dates that turn out quite badly. Okay, and if you look at scientific record of very accomplished scientists, most of the time, they write papers that are not very consequential. And so you're just trying to find the one case that will make a huge difference. And it's difficult. Life is difficult. If it was easy, then everyone would have it. So the point is, without trying, without going on dates, you will obviously not marry anyone. Okay? And you have to give yourself a chance to be wrong. And the way to do it is just like a kid. It's a learning experience. We should behave like kids. Scientists should be open-minded, curious, rather than protecting their ego, protecting their image so that they can, because it's not about prizes. Think about it. All these awards and prizes and that we get are completely meaningless. What matters is the intellectual content of what we find. And I would much rather find this iPhone 100 than win the Nobel Prize for the fact that the expansion of the universe is accelerating.
And Avi,
because of the intellectual content of the meaning that it will have to humanity.
Okay, and assume for the moment, just to take your date analogy, that you go on a blind date and you're not really connecting, and you find out the person is into the occult and not the right person for you. Do you immediately demand all your money back, or do you say, look, if I'm going to go on a few dates, I expect that I'm going to pay for a lot of dinners that lead nowhere?
Well, that's exactly what happened with the Large Hadron Collider. Aside from the Higgs, the mission was to find supersymmetry in the natural parameter space that everyone recommended. We haven't found supersymmetry. Did anyone commit suicide as a result? No. We just said, okay, well, maybe it's around the corner. Maybe it's at higher energy.
Or maybe, isn't it great that we found that low energy supersymmetry isn't present, because we could have written an endless number of articles on low energy supersymmetry at the electroweak scale. And without actually having an accelerator, we wouldn't know. I mean, I was just at this conference where the person said, here are all the models we've ruled out. Here's the one model that remains. And it was amazing to look at parameter space. And, at a certain level, if you keep hearing about some gal that you should really go on a date with because she's looking for the same things you are, and you find out that, in fact, it's not a workable situation. You've paid for dinner, but you've learned something valuable. You don't have to keep listening. Hey, you really need to find out what's going on with Susan these days.
Exactly. You learn no matter what. We gain knowledge as a result of getting more evidence. The only way not to gain knowledge is to behave like experts, because they say our past knowledge is all that we need. There is nothing else. If we studied rocks in the past, everything in the sky is rocks.
Yeah.
That's it. It must be
But,
natural.
and
So
then the
that's,
last question, Avi, just to
yeah.
do this. What do you think the most persuasive scientific critiques that you're worrying about of your own projects and your own theories are, as opposed to which ones play well or seem to be damning? Like, in other words, what is it that gets through to you that you're worrying about at night? Because I really want people to understand that trying to get rid of silliness isn't trying to get rid of critique. It's a question of, you really have to focus on what is germane, what is collegial, and what is constructive. So, what is it that you're worried about with extraterrestrial technology and probes and visitors that you might have most wrong here?
Yeah. So I'll give you a specific example. In the case of Oumuamua, the most unusual anomaly was that apparently there was it exhibited an excess acceleration away from the sun, excess push away from the sun by such some mysterious force, because we didn't see it evaporating. There was no rocket effect. And what worried me the most is that the measurement of the trajectory was wrong, was off. And so, together with my postdoc, John Forbes, we really looked really carefully into the data, what could be errors that they didn't account for. And and that was after we wrote the paper with Shmuel Bialy, where we suggested maybe it's an artificial object, a very thin object pushed by reflecting sunlight. So what worried me is that the measurement is wrong. And um, we went through this with my postdoc for several months to check that the conclusions that were drawn from the data were correct, and we confirmed it. But this is an example where a situation where there seemed to be an anomaly, but it's actually in the way the data was analyzed and not in the properties of the objects. And I constantly worry about this, and I could be wrong. I was wrong in some other cases in my scientific career, and but that's part of my learning experience. I'm not afraid of being wrong, and I think if you don't dare to collect more data, you will never figure out what's behind anomalies.
My biggest fear is that I'm being propagandized by a disinformation campaign that was constructed by the government to keep certain things secret. And I have no hard data, but I have mountains of indirect evidence. And
Well,
so I'm
Eric,
I'm worried that, in fact, there is no there at a scientific level, but there will be a there at a government trust and disinformation level. So that's like one of my biggest concerns.
I
yeah,
want to
but
also
I'm
mention.
I'm talking about objects that were discovered by astronomers.
No. You were talking about a different issue. I'm just saying,
Right. But
I've never said anything one way or the other about Oumuamua or anything like that.
right. But one thing I should advise you, Eric, is um,
Hmm.
don't worry too much about government. Here we're dealing with nature. Okay, so government is completely secondary. They cannot change what nature gives us. Okay,
Yeah.
and I give much more respect to nature than to government, because nature obeys according to physics, a universal set of laws. Government does not.
So, guys, I want to pivot in the remaining time we all have, hopefully, to another subject, with your permission, and that's an issue that Avi has written very poetically and lovingly about, and it involves academia, but specifically scientific family. I want to refer people to in the show notes down there. When you go down there and you take your thumb and you click the like button, if you want to see these guys back on this podcast or people like that in this conversation. When you're down there, you'll see a link to Avi's second Medium post, and it's about academia, and it's the joys of an academic family. Avi, what prompted you to write this lovely, touching article? And Eric hasn't seen it, perhaps, but I want to discuss on what academia could be, what it hasn't been maybe for the past decades, and where it could be with things like we've talked about, with NFTs, with DAOs, with AI and other acronyms. So, Avi, take it away. What was this article's intention?
Well, last week, my former students and postdocs, about 60 of them, organized a conference to celebrate my 60th birthday. It was a scientific conference, but during the coffee breaks and at the banquet, many of them came over to me to tell me for the first time that I made a big impact on their lives. And that was a big
Mhm.
revelation and the biggest reward that I ever received, or you can call it an award, in a sense, because I always tried to help young people, and when I was department chair, I was always on the side of the faculty. If there was an issue with the higher administration, I fought for the faculty. And the same deal with students and postdocs that were mine. I always sided with them and tried to help them, because I very much sympathize with their vulnerability. And so during the banquet, for example, last week, many of them stood up and mentioned stories. And, you know, some of these brought tears to my eyes. I simply forgot how much I helped some of them, and they brought it up. And it was very moving to me. Now, we also had a soccer match between the postdocs and the faculty. And I should say the faculty won 2-0, and I was fortunate to score one of the goals. But the good news is that the postdocs will become faculty in the coming years. And altogether, people told me after this conference that it was one of the most unusual conferences they ever attended, because it did feel like an academic family where like-minded people, my students and postdocs that think, you know, just like me, since I sort of trained them in this way, they are curious about a wide range of topics, and they never spoke to each other. Each of them knew me from the interaction with me, and not they did not interact among themselves. So for them, it was really the first family meeting. And, you know, in a way, if something bad happens to me in my morning jog, if a car runs over me every morning when I jog at 5 a.m. so that there isn't much risk, but it's possible that the car would run over me. Now I have the sort of peace of mind that my academic DNA will be preserved in this very, how should I say, vibrant group of innovative scholars that are sort of my academic children. And there is a lot of joy in recognizing that, some bliss, I would say. And being in Martha's Vineyard all of last week in their company was probably the best week of my life. And it's very different. You have to understand, it's very different from conferences where, you know, that are specialized on a specific topic. Here it was more the theme of the way I do my science that was translated into the careers of so many people that have a common thread, which is, let's be driven by curiosity. Let's forget about the nonsense of trying to prove that we are smart. And everyone was conversing in a very collegial fashion. So,
Mhm.
you know, that was, and I mentioned that in my Medium essay. That anyone is interested.
Mhm. Yeah,
Find
so
it.
it's linked down below. Eric, you and I have talked before about academia and in particular Harvard, and I don't think that it's a secret that Harvard kind of has an outsized impact on the culture of academia. It's our oldest institution, I believe, next to the second best Ivy League, which is Brown University, where I got my PhD. But Avi, when we look at it, we think about what these institutions mean. You and I do the same thing, and I'm convinced Eric should have done this, but he decided to go off in a different direction. But as professors, we stand in front of a piece of rock and we scrape on it with another piece of rock called chalk, and we basically are just up there, the sage on the stage in front of people. For the first time in, I think, history, as far as I know, I taught a cosmology class this quarter that I used demonstrations and experiments in. I did experiments in thermodynamics. I did experiments in acoustic waves to teach CMB, acoustic oscillations. I did spectroscopy. I did all sorts of fun stuff, Geiger counter, heavy water. But even that, you know, I can't really hurt my arm patting myself on the back. So it wasn't that much. What can we do about academia? Eric, especially I want to get from your opinion. You have reached millions of people with very vivid displays, and I put a link to the portal and your webpage down below. How can we reform education? How can we not cancel Harvard, but how can we reform this institution that's 1,000 years old, since the first university in Bologna, Italy? We've basically not changed at all, and I think it's overdue for a change. Eric, first you, then Avi.
More or less, I think we had things pretty well in hand until we lost our discipline, hope, and funding. So my feeling about this is that in order to restore this, we're going to have some huge wins that come from people who cannot be subsumed in this sort of sweeping critique that has crashed over academics, that somehow academics is the most bigoted, exclusive, toxically male environment. Lots of these things have some truth to them, but there was also a lot of things that um, that happened that were miraculous, wonderful cultures like Isidore Rabi's lab at Columbia that allowed people who were barred from universities at that level to come and do scientific work, where more or less there has to be a scientific underground, an underground railroad to smuggle good ideas, good people, the money they need, the support they need. I heard about Avi's conference celebrating his 60th birthday. Happy birthday, Professor Loeb. But the thing that really made me sad was that as an orphan, as a guy who did not have an advisor, I can tell you that there's a different romance towards being on your own, and there's a romance towards being part of a worldview. And I think that the people like Avi, who try to make sure that their students survive, who are no nonsense when it comes to the research, who make sure that they have a legacy, are really important. And I think Harvard in particular is the pivot point. Harvard is both the best and worst place in the entire academic universe. It gets incredible people. It's incredibly tolerant of all sorts of crazy ideas, and it's incredibly brutal backstabbing, behind the scenes, back of house nonsense at the same time. And so in a certain sense, what we have to do is to recognize that the most important part of academics is to restore some concept of professional ethics so that people have the freedom to share their ideas, that they know that they're going to have an ability to feed their family the next day, that they have to uphold professional ethics or they're out, because we cannot afford an even small number of relatively smart people to destroy the entire thing by infecting it with snark and Twitter culture, as we've seen with journalism. So I think that, roughly speaking, we need to have some huge wins. The huge wins need to come from individuals, not groups. Those individuals need to be communally minded. They need to say very clearly that we need more resources. We need to shut down weaker PhD programs. We need to focus on research and not teaching, because it's very in vogue to think that a university is primarily focused on teaching. A research university is focused primarily on research and allows for teaching to happen. And there's a reason. If you want to go to a college, you need to go to a college. But part of the problem is that a lot of things that made our great research universities fantastic institutions don't play well to 2022 years. And those of us who believe in the mission of a university and its own diversity, equity, and inclusion program called Merit need to stand up vocally and say certain people need to leave, certain programs need to be shut down, more money needs to be found. We need to stop lying that everything has to do with groups and not individuals. Power laws are everywhere. And we've got to be more courageous, standing up for ourselves, and not wilt every time somebody calls you a white supremacist for just saying the obvious truth.
Yeah. If I may bring up several other aspects that need improvement. There is a lot of room for improvement, I must say, coming from within academia. Harvard's president, Bacow, announced that he will step down a year from now. And I was asked by the Crimson, what do I think is a good future for Harvard? And I said that it has been 70 years since James Conant was the last scientist who served as Harvard's president, and that shows. And nowadays, society is very much driven by science and technology. And my point is, it doesn't mean that we should abandon the humanities. In fact, there is a huge role for the humanities to be playing in the modern technological age. For example, lots of ethical questions that AI systems, social media bring to the front. and philosophers and ethicists have a very important role in shaping the future of society. But it needs to be about the future, not about the past. I mean, of course, we can study what ancient Greeks said, but they never had the gadgets that we have. So we need to bring up new philosophical ideas to bear with the new reality that we live through. And so that's the future that the university should aspire to promote. And therefore, the next president needs to be a scientist. Now, I don't think they would listen to my advice. They haven't listened last time around. But that is my sincere hope that, science and technologies will lead the way. And the basic message of science is sharing of knowledge and cooperation. And science does not adhere to national borders. And we are all part of the human species, and the knowledge that we acquire through science should be shared. And these are very noble ideas in this age of isolation and separation and fighting each other and wars and so forth. The message that science brings, like, let's work together and make a better future for ourselves. Just to give you another example, Ezra Klein on his New York Times podcast a few days ago spent 15 minutes trying to answer the following question: should I decide not to have children because of the implications to climate change? That was the question. And to me, the answer, it would have taken me a few seconds to answer that question, but he spent 15 minutes. And here is my answer. The future is within the realm of our scientific accomplishments. We can make policy based on our scientific understanding. We can decide how to leave our planet and go to space, and not risk the future of humanity by a single point catastrophe here on Earth based on science and technology. And so my point is, we should have as many kids as we want, the more the better, and then let them shape a better future using science, and these could be our biological kids, or they could be our technological kids, using AI systems to help us, because they will become smarter than us in the future. So I'm much more in favor of the replacing Darwin's principle of survival of the fittest with survival of the optimist. You have to be an optimist so that the future will be much more promising. If you decide not to have kids, it's as if you decided you prefer death over life.
Right.
If you wanna, and Albert Camus in his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, the first sentence there says the biggest question in philosophy is whether life is worth living,
Right.
or should we commit suicide. And that's the biggest question in philosophy. I say, if you expand that to humanity as a whole, to our civilization, the biggest question is whether humanity is worth longevity, surviving longer forever. And this is the most important question in the context of science, not in the context of philosophy, but in the context
I agree. I actually think it's even deeper than that. And just to point out, there's a saying, the optimist builds the plane, but the pessimist builds the parachute. It's appropriate to talk about this on the eve of Father's Day, of course. And it doesn't take, as you said, it doesn't take children. We don't all have to be fathers or mothers or parental units of unspecified gender. We could also be ideological and thought leaders, thought mentors, men and women, to children. But I want to ask you something, Avi, that Eric and I have spoken a lot about, is the lack of diversification of the portfolio of those that speak about, like Elon Musk, who we both have affection for and admiration for in a lot of ways, but see criticism of as well. But Eric, one of the listeners asking a question on my where I take questions on my community page, my YouTube channel, is why are we so kind of all in one basket, putting our eggs in all in one basket? How do you react to Elon Musk's approach to, let's become interplanetary, let's go to one other planet, let's double our planets in our portfolio management? What do you think about Elon Musk? I've never asked you, Avi. What's your analysis of his approach?
First of all, I wanted to say that another thing missing in academia that I didn't have a chance to mention is diversity of ideas. Okay, and we touched about it before, but basically, the idea of tenure is all about allowing people to have job security so that they can promote ideas that are not along the beaten path, okay? And unfortunately, it's not being used. When people get tenure, they become lazy and they don't do much. They become dead wood very often. So it's being abused. This privilege is really an amazing privilege. I mean, we don't get paid a lot in academia, but we do have the privilege of job security, and we should take advantage of it. We should explore ideas that are not conventional. And that's another thing that needs to change in academia. Now, coming back to Elon Musk, of course, you know, there are major hurdles. For example, if you go to the surface of Mars, you will be bombarded by cosmic rays and your body would not survive for more than a year or a few years. That needs to be solved. And one way is to go down underground, you know, in a cave and they live there, or there needs to be special infrastructure built to protect people over there, and also people on travel there. You don't want, I mean, you don't want to send people to their death, and so that those practical concerns were not attended to in a very public way, in a very science oriented. So I really think we should solve the health risks that the people will face when going to long term to Mars. Otherwise, I think, by the way, I don't think humans are really the future of humanity. Okay, I think the future of humanity is some very advanced form of autonomous robots with artificial intelligence. I do believe that, and I'm proud of our technological kids, because you know they will be able to survive much better. You know, why would some random processes of on the surface of Earth in a soup of chemicals make the best possible outcome? You know, that to me it sounds like well, we got to this point, but we have a lot of faults. You know, if you look at human history, clearly humans have a lot of faults, and perhaps we can build a system that will be better than humans. And I'm looking forward for the first AI scientists, you know, because they will not be driven by their ego. If they see an object that looks like a rocket booster, they will not call it a rock.
I want to ask you about that, Avi. I'm sorry to interrupt, Eric. I'm going to give you a chance. I'm going to give you a requisite 30 seconds to respond. But but Avi, I want to push back with love and kavod and respect. Okay, so this guy here, do you know what he said his happiest thought was, Avi? You know, I'm sure you know what he said his happiest thought was, right?
Go ahead, say it.
That in free fall you experience no gravitational field. Now let's unpack an AI Einstein, AE. How does such a thing know about free fall? Like, what does that even mean? And second of all, what does happiness mean to such a, or in other words, are you really serious? You think AI physicists are around the corner, or is that kind of wishful thinking? That
no.
Optimism?
I
irrepressible optimism.
You can imagine a system that will basically digest data provided to it by instruments directly. So the instruments will send the data to the AI system that will analyze it and try to figure out what's going on. And it's the job of a scientist right now. It looks like, you know, a miracle, but in principle, you know, it could be done by a machine. I don't think humans are necessarily designed for that purpose. You know, we were gatherers and hunters. We were not scientists to start with. So our brain is not necessarily optimized for the purpose of being a scientist. And I have no problem getting pride from a system that outperforms us. I don't have a, you know, that doesn't give a blow to my ego in any way. In fact, I would be extremely happy if I knew that we can build a system that corrects the faults of humans.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Eric, stepping back from the AI stuff to any of the topics that I rudely interrupted you over.
No. By the way, with 3 Jews on a podcast, I'm surprised that I'm the only one interrupting either one of the two of you. So you guys are clearly much better bred and influenced by our
just imagine the number of opinions that we have right now. And it is getting close to Shabbat. I don't want to interfere with Avi's Shabbat, but I do want to thank you guys.
Wait! I didn't say anything.
No, I know, but go on. Okay, go on.
But by the way, you know, if 3 Jews are on an island, you know how many synagogues you need for that? For them?
4.
You need 4, yeah, because you need one that their foot would never step in.
Eric.
Okay, so where were we? The AI physicists. Look, I'm partial to humans, and I'm actually partial to egos I mean, all sorts of things that I like, everybody has decided are terrible. I like humans, I like egos. I'm glad I agree with both of you that we should have children, and that Ezra should probably remove himself and leave the rest of us alone in the gene pool. Um, Look, we're in dire circumstances, and what we're looking for is an analog of the neutron. And the neutron changed everything because it allowed chain reactions, and that ushered in the atomic age. Or the semiconductor changed everything. Or the World Wide Web that came out of CERN. These are things that changed everything, whether it's radio frequency communications. We're looking for something that obviates the needs for rockets. Rockets are sort of embarrassing in 2022 because there's not that much that can be reached. So, it's like buying a huge boat for a small lake. There's just not that many places you can go. So my feeling about this is we have to reacquaint ourselves with the possible. We've been living so long under Einstein and Bohr that we've forgotten that their limitations may not be our limitations if we can crack a puzzle. And the neutron was 1932, so it's within living memory. What we need to do is to reacquaint ourselves with the idea that finding a single new field or new way of looking at space-time or some adjustment to this order that has settled in, it's now almost 50 years old, is necessary for us to dream again. And nobody dreams about finding, Gilligan's Island was about an uncharted desert isle. It would be very weird to think about an uncharted desert isle in 2022 because we've mapped the Earth, but we haven't mapped the heavens. So I think it's really important to recognize that I fully support my friend Avi on his quest for the AI intelligences and the post-human discoverers. But I'm actually really optimistic that the next theories might have new possibilities for us humans, laden with ego though we may be, for us to survive each other. And I really believe that at some point, Elon is going to get past his fascination with SpaceX rockets and using Mars as the sales job and recognize that he stumbled onto a very correct paradigm, which is that we are in dire straits. If we don't get diversification, those humans are never going to build Avi's next level AI scientists. And I would really like to see ego come back in, people to be hyper motivated to put in 100-hour weeks, chasing dreams, and to try to acquaint us with the cosmos that we may be able to visit. And people, part of the problem is the instant you talk like this, the conversation has been pre-hijacked. People immediately think you mean Mars because Elon has said that we're going to survive because we're going to decamp to Mars, which is not really a realistic proposition via rockets. And then the next part of it is, you must be talking about faster than light travel, Alcubierre warp drives, or wormholes, because those are the only things that Einstein would allow you to use to dream about the cosmos. The idea of saying post-Einstein, that I accept Einstein for who he is and what he did, but he is not the last word. And there would probably not be a Schwarzschild singularity nor a Friedman-Robertson-Walker singularity if his theory was complete. It's probably merely effective. And that is the challenge of our times, to get out of the straitjacket. So the thing that really attracts me to Avi's program, in part, is if there's a 1 in 10,000 chance that we might find a technology that makes use of science that we don't know yet, that's really worth doing, because it's not a paradigm that has ever occurred to us to get a technology beyond human. The only analog of this is biology, where you have a blind watchmaker, and the theory of selection means that there are pathways and pathways beyond pathways in a cell that do things that we don't understand. So the principle of natural selection has done a marvelous job engineering technologies we can only dream about. But the idea that something might have engineered probes and vehicles to visit us is an enticement to thinking about a cosmos that can be visited, and certainly not by rockets, for those of us with humans, families, and egos, who I'm huge fans of and remain so to this day.
Yeah, and I completely agree with Eric that Albert Einstein was not the smartest scientist that ever lived since the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. There must have been a smarter scientist on an exoplanet a billion years ago, and the civilization that benefited from the wisdom of that scientist must have launched probes that would have reached us by now.
Yeah. Well, guys, I am grateful for you, giant, enormous intellects, for a Weinstein, if not an Einstein, and for a Loeb that is a cranial lobe, and a lobe that I love speaking to. Guys, I got into this podcasting because, you know, my day-to-day job, I'm building experiments. I'm looking not for interstellar meteorites, but I'm trying to remove the imprint of cosmic dust from my CMB experiments. Before we depart for this particular occasion, I want to ask each of you if you have anything that you want to mention, advertise, besides your Bitcoin rig, Eric, or Avi, where can people find you? What are you most interested in? Is there anything else that we should discuss on this particular episode?
Well, I have a listing of my opinion essays that you can find on my website at Harvard University. And every few days I write a new one, and you can follow up on the latest developments. And with me, what you see is what you get. So just trust me. And if we find something exciting, you will know about it.
Eric, how about you? Everyone's curious what you're up to.
Well, I mean, I've been to some extent very much focused on physics recently, talking to colleagues and going to meetings and things. What I'm most alarmed by is that we get in touch with the desperation of the current moment with Putin in Ukraine, recognize that we're no longer kidding around, and that it's not safe to continue in this idiom, even if we probably survive this particular misadventure. It's really important that we drive more people towards science and make sure that when they get there, they've got great lives ahead of them, as opposed to this madness of having them eke out a living and constantly apologizing for everything interesting so that they can stay in the good graces. I would look at a 2014 article that I wrote called M Theory String Theory is the Only Game in Town, to the question of what scientific idea is ready for retirement. And there's also an article about Einstein's revenge, which had to do with the idea that people who wanted to quantize gravity ended up instead geometrizing the quantum. And after listening to what is now currently considered cutting edge physics theory, I want to just point out that a lot of people are leaving for quantum computation, trying to do quantum computers, trying to do machine learning. We've got to keep the excitement going. A generation or two has failed at theoretical physics, and it's time for voices that we haven't heard and new people entering the field to be given free rein, in particularly not constantly dogged by the quantum field theory crowd. I've come to the conclusion that quantum field theory is maybe our most powerful theory, but we don't understand it well enough to allow it to select for good new ideas. And I think what we have to do is we have to recognize that we are in a desperate search for new ideas beyond Einstein. They will ultimately have to conform to experiment and make sense of quantum field theory, which works very well. But we're going to have to look to make physics in particular exciting, and we can't back off it. Not everything is equally exciting. Fundamental physics is the only thing that I know of that is a reasonable hope of getting us out of the problem that fundamental physics originally got us into. So I think that this alien stuff is really important, even if I think it's relatively unlikely that it's going to do what I hope it could do for us. We're going to have to find every possible way of breaking out of Einstein's prison. So organizing an Einsteinian prison break, I think, should be all of our top priorities at the moment, because we're in pretty dire straits, but we're definitely a group worth saving. So that's where I am. That's where I'm at.
Let's put them in jail behind bars made of Oumuamua skin. Guys, this has been a treat. We've had over 2,000 people in the room at one time. And but really, what you guys mean in your openness, in your articulation of some of the most complex topics that can exist, and some of the most perilous politically and otherwise, I think it's really important. Avi, I just want to say one thing. You said maybe the next president should be a scientist, and I was thinking, halavai, it should be for the president of the United States as well. Wouldn't that be nice?
That would be,
Or it could
yeah,
be a disaster. Who knows? I mean, those movies that you've seen, where anyway. So for me, I want to express my gratitude. I'm Brian Keating, host of the Into the Impossible podcast, as well as Dr. Brian Keating on YouTube, where I do videos from an experimental perspective, because these brainiacs, like Eric, like Avi, and like many of the colleagues I've had on, are theoreticians, and I think they're incredibly brilliant. But I think the experimentalists need to get a little bit of attention every now and then. So that's my unique angle. Boys, it's been fun. Avi, Yom Haledet Sameach, Shabbat Shalom, and Eric, it's so good to see you, as it always is. And I hope you guys will come back maybe at the end of the summer. We'll get some clarity what's going on with these government panels and so forth, and we'll be able to discuss the real scientific issues